If you're a law student, listen up. We're about to break down a case you absolutely need to know. Chhandupriya versus Rahul Mahod. This is a landmark Bombay High Court judgment, and it digs deep into the messy, complicated intersection of fraud, consent, and the very foundation of a Hindu marriage.
All right, here's our game plan. We're going to start with a dramatic phone call that kicked this whole thing off. Then we'll lay out the legal arguments from both sides. After that, we'll get into the nitty-gritty of the law, see how the court reasoned its way through the facts, and of course, cover the final verdict. We'll wrap it all up by talking about what this case means today for the line between privacy and disclosure.
Okay, let's set the scene. Our story begins right where all the trouble started, with a pretty shocking revelation, just days before the wedding vows were supposed to be exchanged. This is the factual background you need to know. So, this is the central question the Bombay High Court really had to grapple with. And believe it or not, this massive legal question was sparked by one single anonymous phone call that just changed everything. The timeline here is absolutely crucial to understanding the case. So we have Chhandupriya and Rahul. Theirs was an arranged marriage, and they got engaged on February 24th. But then, on June 11th, literally 2 days before the wedding, Rahul, the husband, gets this anonymous call. The person on the other end says they're a well-wisher and drops a bombshell that his fiancée had been in a physical relationship with another man for the last 4 to 5 years. Now, here's where it gets really fascinating. Despite this bombshell allegation, the wedding actually went ahead on June 13th. Apparently, Rahul confronted Chhandupriya and her family, but they still went through with it. But the couple separated almost immediately after. And here's the key fact both sides agreed on. The marriage was never, ever consummated. That admission, it's going to become a pivotal piece of evidence later in court. So, let's look at how this personal drama turned into a full-blown legal challenge. The husband didn't just sue for divorce. His claim was much more serious. He framed it as a case of matrimonial fraud, and that set the stage for a major legal showdown. So at its core, you've got two completely different stories clashing in court. The husband's whole case was that his consent to the marriage was basically a sham because it was obtained by fraud. He argued that his wife hid a material fact, this alleged long-term relationship, and that if he'd known about it, no way would he have gotten married. On the other side, the wife completely denied the affair. She said an anonymous call, that's not real evidence, and basically put the burden back on the husband, saying he hadn't proven a thing. Okay, to really get why the court decided the way it did, we have to get into the weeds of the law itself. Let's take a look at the specific legal tool the judges used to pick this case apart. This is it. This is the legal provision the entire case hinges on. Section 12, subsection 1, Clause C of the Hindu Marriage Act. In plain English, it says a marriage can be annulled if one person's consent was based on fraud about a material fact concerning the other person. So the million-dollar legal question became, does a past affair count as a material fact? And you know, it's really important to understand that the law wasn't always like this. Before an amendment back in 1976, fraud in marriage law was a super narrow concept. It usually just meant you were tricked about the wedding ceremony itself. This change in '76 was huge because it broadened the scope to include any material fact about the person, which is what makes it so relevant to cases like this one. So what does the law actually consider a material fact? Well, legal precedent gives us a pretty good idea. We're talking about the big stuff, the kind of vital details that if you had known about them would have been a deal breaker. Things like a secret previous marriage, a serious illness, or, as this case tested, a person's sexual history and past relationships. Okay, so we have the facts and we have the law. Now let's see how the Bombay High Court took these abstract legal principles and applied them to the very specific and very personal details of this case. So this case didn't actually start at the High Court. First, it went to the family court in Nagpur. And in that initial round, the judge sided with the husband. They found his claims about fraud and concealment to be credible and went ahead and annulled the marriage. It was the wife who then appealed that decision, taking it up to the High Court. And this legal principle is the absolute turning point. Think about it. The allegation of a past affair is something that is within the wife's exclusive personal knowledge. Only she knows the truth. And yet, she chose not to testify. She never took the stand to deny the claims under oath. So the court applied a classic rule of evidence. When you fail to deny something that only you can know about, the court is allowed to draw an adverse inference, basically to assume the allegation has merit.
So when you look at the High Court's logic, it's really built on three main pillars. First, there's that undisputed fact that the marriage was never consummated, which the court saw as a sign of the wife's lack of commitment. Second, there's the husband's testimony about her seeming disinterested during their engagement, which was treated as circumstantial evidence. And third, the real knockout blow, that adverse inference drawn from her refusal to get on the stand and deny the allegations herself.
So, after weighing all the evidence and applying the law, what was the final word? And, more importantly, what kind of lasting impact has this case had on matrimonial law in India? In the end, the High Court dismissed the wife's appeal. It confirmed the family court's original judgment, which means the marriage was officially declared null and void. Legally speaking, that means it's treated as if it never even happened. Let's just quickly recap the court's key findings, the absolute core of its decision. 1. The pre-existing relationship was a material fact. 2. Hiding it was fraud. 3. Because of that fraud, the husband's consent was invalid. And 4. The wife's silence in court was, in the end, fatal to her entire case. And remember, this wasn't just a one-off decision about one couple. It set what's called a binding precedent. That means all the lower courts in the Bombay High Court's jurisdiction have to follow this ruling. It seriously influences how these kinds of matrimonial fraud cases are handled from here on out. All right, let's zoom out a bit and talk about how this case forces us to deal with a very modern and very tricky dilemma. Where do we draw the line between privacy and disclosure?
You know, this case really throws a spotlight on a deep tension in modern relationships. On one hand, everyone has a right to privacy about their past. But on the other hand, there's a legal and, you could say, ethical duty to disclose certain things to someone you're about to marry. So what are you obligated to share, and what can you rightfully keep private? When we look at this case today, we have to ask some tough questions. Like, what should the standard of evidence be for such a serious claim? And as our social norms about relationships and sexuality continue to change, how should the legal definition of what's material to a marriage change right along with it? And that brings us right back to why this case is such a big deal for legal studies. It's a perfect, real-world masterclass. It shows you exactly how a specific law, Section 121Z, interacts with the rules of evidence, like adverse inference, and the fundamental principle that a valid marriage has to be built on free and informed consent. And that leaves us with a final, big question to chew on. This case set a standard based on the evidence and values of its time. But as society continues to evolve, how will and how should the legal definition of a material fact in a marriage evolve right along with it?